Hey everyone, quick thing before we dive in. I was looking at my analytics and it turns out most of the people watching aren't actually subscribed. See this? Way more views than subscribers. If you're enjoying the videos and want to see more, hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow and you'll never miss new uploads. Alright, let's get into it.
They'll tell you I was a fool that night, and they'd be right. But by the end, the fools were dancing with ghosts and calling it a celebration. That's how you make a holiday, I suppose. You botch everything, survive the consequences, and hope it looks like tradition. It began with my idea. And as every knight knows, an idea is far more dangerous than a sword. The kingdom had been glum since summer's end. Fields gone bare, ale gone thin. Spirits sinking faster than the sun. So I, Sir Daniel Fortescue, decided that Gallowmere needed joy. A proper festival, a night to remind everyone how splendidly heroic their champion was. I called it the Harvest of Heroes. The problem, as my captain pointed out, was that the harvest itself had been miserable. Half the pumpkins rotted in the field, the apples were sour enough to pickle a troll's tongue, and the farmers were as cheerful as a cemetery in drizzle. Still, I had promised the king a festival bright enough to make the moon jealous, and I would deliver. I sent riders to gather every pumpkin from the surrounding villages, but the wagons came back half empty. I needed more, brighter, larger, impressive gourds worthy of legend. That's when I remembered the marsh witches. They grew pumpkins the size of carriages down in the mists beyond Hollowmere Lane. Their vines glittered at night like coiled green lightning, and locals swore their crops were watered with something borrowed from the moon. Naturally, I decided their crop would be perfect for our lanterns. Seemed just the sort of rustic magic a patriotic knight might commandeer for the public good. So I dispatched a few soldiers with my most regal decree: requisition of resources for the public good. Tell them, I instructed, that the kingdom thanks them for their civic spirit. When the soldiers returned, they brought back not only cartloads of pumpkins, but also 3 furious witches trailing behind. The eldest's eyes burned like coals fresh from the forge. "Our gourds are bound to the veil," she hissed. "Light them wrongly, and the dead might feel invited." I gave my best knightly laugh, the one meant to sound brave even when I hadn't quite understood the threat. "My good woman, if the dead want to dance, let them buy tickets." They didn't laugh, but they let me take the pumpkins, crates of them, glowing faintly even in daylight. The captain, sensible man that he was, tried once more to dissuade me. "Sir Daniel," he said, standing so straight I thought his spine might snap, "these are no ordinary pumpkins. The marsh folk don't give gifts without strings." He gestured to the crates, where a subtle blue-green luminescence seeped between the slats. "These strings might be nooses." "Nonsense," I replied, waving away his concern like a pesky fly. "What's the worst that could happen? A few spooky lights? Perhaps the villagers will think it's part of the entertainment." The captain just sighed and muttered something about famous last words before marching off to prepare the guard for what he clearly expected would be mayhem. I should have listened, of course, but listening has never been my strong suit, especially when it means abandoning a perfectly good bad idea. By week's end, Gallowmere buzzed like a hive. Villagers strung ribbons between cottages, hung lanterns, and brewed enough cider to float a horse. I oversaw everything personally, heroic supervision being my strongest skill. I'd even written a speech to deliver before the grand lighting, a stirring declaration about unity, harvest, and courage. It took me most of the morning to memorize it, which is to say, I nearly didn't. "Good people of Gallowmere," I rehearsed before a mirror in my chambers, puffing my chest. "Let this be a night to remember." The mirror promptly fell over, foreshadowing in hindsight, though I took it then as bad carpentry. Still, not all were pleased. Farmers complained I'd taken too much of their harvest. Blacksmiths muttered that the Festival of Fortesque, as it was now being called, sounded less about courage and more about ego. Even the children grumbled, though carving faces into the witches' glowing pumpkins kept them quiet enough. A few rebellious souls hid their own smaller gourds in barns, saying if my grand spectacle went up in smoke, at least they'd have something left to stew. I heard the gossip but ignored it. Leadership demands thick armor, especially around the ears. When the final evening arrived, I strode through the square in full plate, helm tucked beneath my arm. The air smelled of cinnamon, roasted squash, and faint arrogance, mostly mine. Torches ringed the fountain, musicians tuned their lutes, and the great cart of witch pumpkins awaited its moment. Villagers gathered with lanterns and mugs. My armor shone like polished bone. I could already picture the king's approval. Perhaps he'd declare it an annual affair, a holiday in my honor. Fortesque Day has a ring to it. The nobles arrived in their finery, cloaks sweeping the cobblestones as they paraded through the square. I noticed Lord Caldwell eyeing me with that particular mix of envy and disdain that told me I'd done something right. His daughter, the same one who had once called me Sir Deleske at the summer tournament, now smiled and waved a lace handkerchief in my direction. Amazing how success changes perceptions. Or perhaps it was just the way the torchlight flattered my profile. I climbed the platform beside the mayor, who looked ready to faint from nerves or cider. "Sir Dan," he whispered, "perhaps we should light fewer lanterns? The glow might—" "Nonsense," I said. "The brighter, the better. Tonight we proved that courage burns hotter than fear." He muttered something about insurance, but the trumpets drowned him out. The first torch touched the first pumpkin, and every other lantern blazed alive in unison. Not orange, but blue. A cool, shimmering light, like the surface of a lake under starlight. Beautiful. Unnatural. The crowd gasped, then cheered. Even I felt a pang of awe. For about 30 seconds. Then the air turned colder, the music faltered, and the carved faces began to grin wider than before. From the corners of the square came whispers, low and slow, half wind, half word. The torches bent toward the pumpkins as though pulled by invisible breath. One musician plucked a chord that snapped all his lute strings at once, a sound like bones breaking in applause. I felt my armor tighten with dread. "Probably just drafts," I said, though the air was still. A tremor rolled underfoot. The fountain water bubbled black. Then came the first hand, a skeletal thing, breaking through the cobblestone like weeds through soil. Another followed, then another. Lord Caldwell's shout of alarm came out as a squeak. His daughter fainted into the arms of a startled guard. The nobles pushed and shoved, trampling their own finery in a desperate attempt to flee, only to find their escape blocked by more skeletal hands erupting from the ground ahead of them. The crowd screamed, mothers grabbed children, men drew knives, and the mayor vanished under a table faster than I'd thought possible for his girth. Skeletons hauled themselves from the earth, old farmers with rusted sickles, soldiers in dented helms, even a bishop still wearing half his robes. But instead of attacking, they stood blinking in the eerie light, confused, almost hopeful. Behind them, the graveyard gates creaked open of their own accord, and more of the dead filed in, as if answering a summons. The villagers screamed. The mayor fainted. I nearly tripped over his wig trying to reach my sword. "Hold!" I shouted, raising my blade. "No undead shall disturb this festival while Sir Daniel Fortescue stands." Unfortunately, I said this while backing directly into the cider cauldron. Nothing robs a proclamation of dignity like smelling of spiced apples. My guards panicked, waving torches, which only made things worse. The pumpkins along the road burst one by one, spraying fiery seeds like mortar fire. The dead recoiled, then advanced. A dog caught fire and ran shrieking into the tavern. Within minutes, the square was pure bedlam. The musicians tried to play something heroic to steady the nerves. A jig, I think, but the drummer fainted into his own drum, producing a final comedic thump. When one of the witch pumpkins near the ale barrels erupted in blue flame, people took it as a sign of apocalypse and ran. A stable boy collided with the cider cauldron, splashing fire across the square. The night erupted into shrieks, smoke, and flying pastries. And of course, because disaster never travels alone, the villagers decided to blame me. "Fortescue's folly!" someone yelled. "This was a trap!" another cried. "Military drill, is it?" "We're the practice dummies," shouted a third. The accusations grew faster than the flames. One brave woman hurled a pumpkin that struck my shoulder with a wet splutch. I drew myself up, soaked and sticky, and attempted dignity. "Citizens, please, remain calm." At which point, a pie, apple I believe, hit me square in the visor. The soldiers tried to restore order, but every command sounded like mockery over the chaos. Chickens escaped from overturned crates, witches' familiars darted through the crowd, and one particularly unlucky cat caught fire and sprinted screaming through the mayor's tent, spreading small blazes as it went. In the midst of it all, I saw movement atop the distant hill. The marsh witches stood in silhouette, the glow of the cursed pumpkins reflecting in their eyes. They weren't attacking, they were watching, laughing. I could hear it even over the pandemonium. 3 distinct cackles riding the wind. My cheeks burned hotter than the fires around me. I grabbed a fallen banner and tried to wave it like a flag of command. We must regroup. Protect the... A pumpkin exploded beside me, showering me in seeds. My armor steamed. I sneezed. The world was chaos incarnate, and I was its self-appointed conductor. Amid the chaos, I heard angry shouts, farmers blaming me for provoking the witches, merchants demanding repayment for ruined stalls. One woman threw a loaf of bread so stale, it nearly dented my helm. Others began pulling down my banners. Someone yelled, "Let the knight fix his own mess." They weren't wrong, though I preferred they wait until after I'd survived it. The king's messenger, who had been watching from a safe distance, approached me with an expression that suggested the royal displeasure would be monumental. "His Majesty will hear of this," he said primly, stepping over a puddle of flaming cider with distaste. "He specifically asked me to observe how well you managed large gatherings after the incident at the spring tournament." "The jousting mishap wasn't my fault," I protested weakly, though we both knew that letting children use the practice shields as makeshift boats had been entirely my suggestion. "Indeed," said the messenger, making a note in a small leather book. "I'm sure His Majesty will find this current situation equally blameless." His sarcasm could have cut steel. Smoke and seed pulp stung my eyes. The square pitched like a ship in rough water, screaming, arguing, the sort of noise that makes courage and good sense both decide to wait outside. I took a breath that tasted of burned sugar and swamp moss and thought, "Daniel, you magnificent idiot, you've invented a riot with better lighting." Then I saw him, a skeleton in a rusted breastplate, its badge carved with a wheat sheaf, a farmer once, and a militiaman in some forgotten skirmish. He had raised his arm to swing, at me, at anything, but stopped. His skull tilted, slow as a wind vane. He wasn't looking at my sword. He was looking at the pumpkin. He stepped closer to a lantern gourd, whose grin was stretching itself into a more welcoming shape with every flicker. The blue fire within it flared. He reached out, not to strike, but to warm his hands. You can't imagine how it felt, that single small gesture in the middle of catastrophe. I've seen men beg for mercy and ghosts claw for vengeance, but I had never seen a dead man simply seeking comfort. Another skeleton, ribbons clinging to brittle cuffs, leaned toward a candle as though smelling it. A third bent his skull down, so a child too terrified to run could place a cup of cider in his bony grasp. The cup trembled, lifted, paused. The cider disappeared in a way that should not be possible. And yet, I swear to you, the bones sighed. The marsh witch's warning rang in my head. Our gourds are bound to the veil. Light them, and the dead will dance. I had heard the threat. What they had offered, in their crooked way, was an invitation. The pumpkins weren't lures for malice. They were beacons for homesick souls. "Stand down!" I bellowed to my soldiers, louder than the bells, louder than the panic. "Stand down!" They hesitated. One, young as spring and terrified, had his sword raised over a skeleton, still trying to figure out how to sit on a stool without a backside. "Sir," he called. "Orders?" "New orders," I said, lifting my visor so they could see my eyes, could see that I'd found something steadier than pride. "If the dead want company, we'll give it. No blades, no blows, only bread and seats." "Bread and..." he blinked. "For the dead?" "They're guests," I said. "Ill-timed, poorly invited, but guests all the same." He lowered his sword. Others followed, some with relief so clear it hurt to look at. You never know how many men crave permission not to fight until you give it. I climbed onto the edge of the fountain, slipped on a smear of pumpkin, and caught myself on a bronze cherub's head, gaining a bruise that would later flower. I cleared my throat. People of Gallowmere, I shouted. The witches meant to humiliate me, and may I say, they have done a thorough job, but what they've given us is not a massacre, it's a meeting. A thrown onion missed by a whisker and thumped the cherub. I pressed on. If your grandmother stands before you with none of her old warmth, give her a cup and find it again. If an old soldier you once feared has come to your fire, bid him sit and listen to a song that doesn't end in a scream. If some stranger without a name touches your lantern, do not snatch it away. Share the light. Somewhere in the back, the mayor peeked from under a fallen tablecloth, like a tortoise reconsidering life. The fiddler, seeing an audience no longer trying to trample him, lifted his instrument with shaking hands. The lute had lost its guts, the drum its drummer, but the fiddle still had 4 strings and an old tune to tell. Play, I said to him. Nothing bold, something that remembers. He played a slow strain, a field song. You'd know it if you've ever had dirt under your nails and a prayer under your tongue. A tune you don't so much hear as recognize. The dead turned their skulls toward the sound. The living breathed, some for the first time in minutes. A mother set a lantern between herself and what had once been her boy, and the blue light made both their faces gentler. A pair of bony hands, delicate as a spider's web, clapped on the offbeats, discovering rhythm again like an old toy in a new room. The cat, no longer aflame, limped back into view, with singed whiskers and a wicked opinion of me. In that thin-boned hush, I felt the witch's gaze shift. The laughter on the hill ceased. The wind, which had been pushing us toward panic, backed off and watched. I climbed down. You, I said to the baker, who had just been about to brain a skeleton with a peel. 2 loaves and that pot of stew. Serve from the left. He has no right. The baker snorted despite himself, and obeyed. And if he starts chewing the crock, Sir Dan, he muttered. Praise his appetite, I said, and fetch him a spoon. To the brewers, cups on the fountain lip. If the drink goes missing, but no one drinks, don't question a blessing. To the children, if one of them follows you, don't run. Walk, lanterns high. Let them see what they've missed. To my soldiers, each in turn, sheath the iron and find the benches. Bring chairs from the council room. Why should the dead stand when scoundrels sit? We moved like a town in a drill none of us had learned, and all of us suddenly remembered. And a strange thing happened. Order, not the rigid kind with lines and salutes, but the soft, practical sort that arises around fires and tables. The kind that grew Gallowmere before any of us were born. A skeleton with lace at its cuffs tried to laugh, and rattled instead. The woman across from it laughed for both. Someone placed a scarf around a skull that had clearly been cold for decades. An old dog, ears like flags, crept under a table and laid its head on a bony shin with a sigh of satisfied auditing. My own pride, which had been walking around the square with a drum and a looted trumpet, took one look at the scene and sat down, muttering, "All right then, that's better than applause." I saw Lord Caldwell hesitantly offering a handkerchief to a skeleton in the tattered finery. The skeleton took it with a courtly bow that suggested they might have known each other in life. His daughter, recovered from her swoon, was teaching 3 bone children a clapping game by the fountain, their laughter ringing like small bells in the night air. Even the king's messenger looked reluctantly impressed, his quill poised over his notebook, but seemingly unable to find words for the scene unfolding before him. I looked up to the marsh hill. The witches stood conferring, heads bowed together, the way conspirators do when a prank has just blossomed into a parable. The youngest lifted her hands. A prickle ran through the square, a change in the blue light, a warmth like ovens when the bread finally rises. The pumpkin's grins settled, the whispering lost its teeth and kept its tune. They weren't lifting the curse, not yet. But they were easing the edges, the way a seamstress runs a thumb along a tight stitch. I took that as permission and started introductions. Sir Daniel Fortescue, I told the skeleton farmer, offering my hand. He looked at it, puzzled, then placed his own bones in mine with a click that sounded, absurdly, like gratitude. My fields were near the barrow path, he rasped, voice like wind through barley. We had a willow that wagged its branches when the weather was lying. We still use its shade, I said. I didn't know if it was true, but I felt it. He nodded slowly, a monarch receiving tribute. I turned. A seamstress, well, a skeleton in a tatted collar, traced the seams of a child's sleeve, approving the stitches with professional pride. "A good hem knows where it's going," she whispered without voice. "It does tonight," I told her. "We all do. You may think this sentimental. Perhaps it is. But I will tell you this. Men on battlefields die hoping for their mothers. In Gallowmere, some of them found their way back to pumpkin light instead. And for 1 hour, that was enough. The witches waited until the square had turned from battlefield to banquet. Then they descended. They don't walk so much as arrive, the marsh witches. One moment, the path is empty. The next moment, it has always contained 3 women with mud to their shins and autumn in their eyes. The crowd hushed. Even the dead angled their skulls toward the marsh smell, as if a familiar kitchen had opened its door. The eldest spoke. "Sir Daniel Fortescue," she said, and my spine thought about being brave. "You requisitioned what was not yours." "I did," I said, "with arrogance and ignorance. You may tar and feather me in eels as you please, provided the tar is at least warm." The youngest mouth quirked. The middle witch, tall as a gallows frame, held up a finger. "Yet, when your folly called forth our neighbors," she said, "you set down your sword." "I did," I said. "I prefer to keep my head the size it is. It struggles with helmets as it is." "Modesty," said the eldest, "learned at last. Oh, wonders." "Not so much modesty as exhaustion," I admitted, "but I will take credit for either." They smiled the way winter smiles, thin and full of teeth, but not cruel. The youngest lifted her hands, her fingers splayed, and for a breath the pumpkins burned white as bone and gentle as milk. A tremor went through the dead. One by one, they stood. "We will lift it," said the eldest, "before dawn. The door closes at rooster's breath. Until then," and here her eyes gleamed with a humor I would not have trusted if it hadn't felt so right. "Dance with your mistakes." I bowed, lower than I had ever bowed in perfectly dry armor. "Ladies," I said, "if we must be haunted, let it be by good stories." "Good stories," repeated the middle witch, "require good endings." She looked at me with a warning that somehow managed to be a blessing. "Do not squander yours." The fiddler heard, summon or spell, I don't know which, but his bow found a reel older than the marsh itself. The drum, revived by a boy with more will than sense, thumped along. And Gallowmere, mad, muddled Gallowmere, danced. Do not ask me to explain how bones waltz without feet, or how hands hold partners they pass through. I have seen stranger things that made less sense and more sorrow. This was simple. We pretended the old rules were still in place, and the night pretended with us. Children learned the steps from grandmothers who had no lungs left to teach with. Young men stopped trying to impress and started trying to remember. I, who had begun the evening with speeches and ended it with stew stains, found myself grinning like a carved fool. At the edge of the square, the cat, now singed into humility, curled on the youngest witch's shoulder and purred like a kettle enjoying its job. The hour before dawn is a soft one, softer when you've survived your own ambition. The stars pale, the air chooses a temperature, and consequences knock with a politeness you cannot refuse. One by one, the dead began to straighten in that peculiar way of theirs that says we've had enough of this borrowed time. They looked to the pumpkins, now burning a warmer color, closer to harvest than haunting. A farmer raised his hand as if to tip a hat he'd lost decades ago. A boy waved both arms as though he might keep a bit of this in his bones for later. The seamstress patted a shoulder she couldn't feel and turned toward the path. "Wait," said a little girl, voice shaking a leaf back onto its tree. "Will you come next year?" The skeleton paused. It looked at the witches, who looked at me, which I admit was unfair. I cleared my throat. "If the lanterns are lit," I said, "and if we keep good manners with those who tend the marsh, then yes. Next year, and the year after, and the year after that, until the candles of Gallowmere go out for good, which I do not intend to allow." The eldest witch nodded once. "So sworn," she said, and the marsh shivered assent. At the first rooster's cough, the youngest witch spread her hands again. The blue withdrew like a tide that had decided the shore was charming, but noisy. The pumpkins' faces settled into honest grins. The dead, with a neatness that surprised me and will haunt me kindly to the end of days, walked home by way of the graveyard path. No fading, no trick. Simply a decision to be absent again. Silence dropped like a blanket freshly warmed, then the living breathed. It is a sound you never notice until you thought you had lost it. Dawn came up the far hill with a ridiculous smugness. Sooty, sticky, blinking, we regarded what we had done to our town. It looked like a battlefield, and a bakery had eloped and fought on the altar. And yet, there was a peace under the mess, the kind of quiet that comes after a good story's last line. The mayor crawled out from wherever mayors go when they regret their hat choices. He patted his wig, patted his belly, and patted me. "Sir Daniel," he said hoarsely, "this was either the worst disaster in Galamir's history or the finest idea you've ever had." "Both," I said, swaying. "Let's call it tradition and clean up very slowly." People laughed, honest laughter, the sort that knows exactly what it's laughing at and loves it anyway. The king's messenger approached, his notebook filled with what I imagined were carefully detailed accounts of my numerous failures throughout the night. "His Majesty," he began stiffly, "will want to know that Sir Daniel Fortescue has established a new tradition," interrupted Lord Caldwell, appearing at my side with surprising warmth. "One that honors both the living and the dead. I shall personally vouch for its unexpected success." The messenger frowned, clearly displeased at having his report contradicted before he could even deliver it. "I must record what I observed," he insisted. "Then observe this," said Lord Caldwell, gesturing broadly at the square where villagers and nobles alike were helping each other clean up, recounting their experiences with animated hands and laughter. "A town united." The messenger's quill hesitated, then began scratching across his page with a distinctly begrudging air. And then they were gone, as witches do, leaving only the scent of wet earth and smug satisfaction. When the sun rose, Galamir was still humming. The villagers spoke of making the festival an annual thing, a night for lanterns, laughter, and remembering the dead kindly. They called it All Hallows' Eve. As for me, I took credit naturally. A knight must protect his reputation. That, my friend, is how our harvest festival began. With hubris, chaos, a touch of witchcraft, and one very sticky night learning that even a disaster can be worth celebrating. After all, anyone can win a battle. It takes real heroism to survive a party in Galamir,